Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. One of the fundamental pillars of our American society is traditional marriage between one man and one woman. During my lifetime, this societal pillar has been under increasing assault to change the definition of marriage. Recently, the U.S. Supreme Court heard two cases concerning the marriage issue. Will the U.S. Supreme Court render another speciously reasoned decision like Judge Roberts did with Obamacare, thereby making, say, traditional marriage meaningless? A decision on these cases will be forthcoming in late June of 2013. Our guest has written at least 2 books on why traditional marriage is both crucial and beneficial for the nuclear family to our American society as a whole. Many important questions and probable outcomes need to be understood. For instance, what will portend for our country if traditional marriage is rebuked? Today's guest will share his perspicacious insights and probable ramifications of the traditional versus same-sex marriage issue. Our guest grew up in Morgantown, West Virginia, the grandson of immigrant coal miners. He received a BA from Swarthmore College, a JD from Harvard Law School, a master's degree from the Harvard Divinity School, and a doctor of philosophy from Oxford University in England. Currently, he's installed as the McCormick Chair of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. He's the past chairman of the National Organization for Marriage. Moreover, he's drafted the Manhattan Declaration, which opposes abortion, embryo-destructive research, and same-sex marriage. Well, welcome, Professor Robert George.
Thank you very much, Brandon. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Dr. George, Professor George, could you give us an overview of how traditional marriage has been under assault since the 1960s or so?
Well, yes, the traditional understanding of marriage is as the institution that brings a man and a woman together as husband and wife to be mother and father to any children who are born of their union. That's an enormous gift to children because children do best, children flourish, or the likelihood of flourishing is the greatest, when children have the benefits of both a mother and a father, both maternal and paternal influences, and where they're brought up in a bond of love and commitment between mother and father, between husband and wife. And of course, children are not simply private interests. They're not simply the private interests of the mother and father. The whole of society has a profound interest in upright citizens, in decent people, in children who are brought up to be honest, hardworking, responsible human beings. And that's why the whole of society has an interest in marriage, understood precisely as I've described it, as the institution that brings a man and a woman together as husband and wife to be mother and father to any children born of their union. Well, that institution has, as you say, been under assault for some time. There's been a very steady erosion in recent decades of that basic understanding of marriage. And there's been a movement toward replacing that understanding with a false understanding or a false conception of marriage as merely sexual, romantic, domestic partnership, ordered and oriented not to the welfare of children, but to the private gratifications and satisfactions of adults. And once that wheel begins rolling, it's very difficult to stop it, and at the end of the day, of course, it's children who suffer from out-of-wedlock births, being brought up without a dad in the picture, marital breakdown at massive rates, a coarsening of society, a coarsening of relationships between men and women, and the whole 9 yards. And so that's what we have seen. The 60s, of course, was famous as the era of the me generation, whose imbecilic slogan was, "If it feels good, do it." Well, that's a slogan that's guaranteed to damage the well-being of children. If it feels good, do it. The slogan we need is be responsible parents, be responsible people, up your bond of husband and wife.
I see. And can I ask you, for our viewers, some that don't know or haven't heard about, what is natural law and how does it figure into the debate of traditional versus homosexual or same-sex marriage?
Well, there's nothing magical in the label natural law. It's a theory of morality. It's a view about right and wrong with its in the ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, especially the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, and the ancient Roman jurists. It is appropriated by Christianity. It becomes incorporated into Christianity after the rise of the Christian faith, and there are also distinguished people within the Jewish tradition who are natural law theorists. And the basic idea there is that while we have the profound benefit from a Christian point of view and from a Jewish point of view of God's revelation, including revelation of norms of conduct by which we should order our lives, it's possible, even apart from revelation, through the natural exercise of our common human capacity for reasoning, to understand important things about moral truth. And those dimensions of moral truth, those vast dimensions of moral truth that are knowable even apart from divine revelation, just by our natural reason, are what we call natural law. Now again, there's no magic about the label. You don't need that name. You can call it by another name. But it's the basic idea that there is a law accessible to reason by which we can order our lives and the lives of our communities uprightly.
I see. Now, in your 2006 book entitled The Meaning of Marriage, Family, State, Market, and Morals, what themes and conclusions did you reach that you wanted folks to know about?
Well, the book is a collection of essays by a number of very important scholars writing from different disciplinary perspectives in different fields, in other words, economists, sociologists, philosophers, political scientists, and so forth. And when they put their heads together, they discovered that from the perspective of each of those fields, we found tremendous personal and social benefits available in the institution of marriage when people are willing to do the work and make the sacrifices to honor true marriage and to make their marriages work, to uphold a culture of marriage in which the institution can flourish. And so, for example, where you have a flourishing marriage culture, there are physical health benefits. There are mental health benefits. There are certainly moral and economic benefits. And it's because marriage is the fundamental institution of our society by which we attend to the health, education, and welfare needs of people. I like to say that the marriage-based family is the original and best Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. No government agency can do for children especially, but for other members of the family who are in need, no institution of government, no agency, federal or state, can accomplish what the healthy marriage-based family regularly accomplishes. Now, that's not to say that every family is perfect. In fact, no family is perfect, and there are many families that are profoundly dysfunctional. But on the whole, throughout human history and across societies, where you have a flourishing marriage culture in all these different dimensions of life, no matter what we study, the economy, the moral foundations of society, criminality, education, we find that where you have a strong marriage culture, where marriage is flourishing, individuals and societies are better off.
Uh-huh. Now, from a pro-life perspective, homosexual marriage leads to fewer children being born. What are the long-term implications of that?
Well, I don't know that that redefining marriage to include same-sex partners in itself would have much of an impact on the demographic situation. I can tell you this, though, where an ethic of personal self-fulfillment or personal autonomy flourishes, where the order of the day is the order of the imperial self, where I'm looking after myself and my needs, and not trying to be generous, not trying to benefit others, not being willing to pass on to new people, to new human beings, a life. We find, of course, a decline in the demographic situation. We find, for example, in the highly secularized nations of Europe, especially in Southern Europe, but really quite across Western Europe and in some parts of Eastern Europe, a virtual demographic collapse. To replace a population, just to maintain a steady state, just to maintain the population at its current level, what human societies need are, on average, 2.1 children per woman. When you drop down to 1.9, and especially get down as low as 1.8, you're going to see a very visible decline in population over time. There are some European nations, such as Italy and Spain now, that are down at 1.3 and even approaching 1.2. Now, that's going to be demographically a catastrophe, and it will be economically a catastrophe as well, especially when you have old age pension systems, what we in the United States call Social Security systems, that require workers, today's workers, to pay for today's retirees. There's only one way to solve that problem if you don't have enough workers, and that is with massive immigration. And of course, that creates, especially in societies that don't have our tradition of assimilation, it creates social problems and pretty profound dislocations.
Well, for instance, marriage has been withering in our American society for some time, whether it's delaying getting married or not getting married. What does the collapse of marriage in the middle and working class America mean for our society?
Well, it's very bad news. If we think our way back to 1965, there was a young, brilliant Harvard sociologist named Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He would go on, of course, to be a United States Senator and famously an ambassador to the United Nations. But in those days, he was a young Harvard professor working for the Johnson administration, a liberal Democratic administration. Moynihan himself, of course, was and remained a liberal Democrat. But he was assigned a study of the situation in the African American community, and he issued a report on the Negro family. And that report rang an alarm bell because he crunched the numbers and found that the out-of-wedlock birth rate among African American women in the African American population had reached 25%, an enormous increase from even the days of the Depression and the days of slavery. So Moynihan warned that if in this community or any community you have large numbers of children being born without fathers anywhere in the picture, the consequences would be delinquency, despair, drug abuse, violence, crime, incarceration, in a vicious cycle that would only get worse and worse. Well, what happened? Well, Moynihan was called a racist. Moynihan was accused of blaming the victim, and we didn't deal with the situation. At that time, Brendan, the out-of-wedlock birth rate for the general population was about 5%. 25% in the African American community, 5% in the population as a whole. Fast forward now to 2013. In the African American community, the out-of-wedlock birth rate is now over 70%. In the general population, it is now over 40%. And among women in peak childbearing years, 18 to 35, the most recent data I've seen indicate that it's nearly 50%. Now, Moynihan was warning the alarm bell and predicting exactly what did come to pass in inner cities and urban areas and so forth as a result of a high out-of-wedlock birth rate in one community. And we're seeing the same thing now, of course, in communities that are not minority, that are white or Caucasian communities, in small towns and rural areas, the same consequences. We need to if we're going to save our society, if we're going to do justice by our children, we're going to have to rebuild the marriage culture across the country, in minority communities, in working class communities, in rural as well as urban communities. It's a big job, but it's critically important to the success of our society and to the well-being of our children.
I can remember being in Philadelphia with my father, and this was back in the 60s, and I heard Lyndon Baines Johnson give a presidential speech at a convention about starting the Great Society and eliminating poverty. What do you feel that the Great Society has been a failure? Has it weakened our families or strengthened our families? And what should we do to promote marriage and strengthen the bonds of marriage in our society?
Well, I'm afraid the verdict is in, and the Great Society really has been a disaster. In many ways, it's been counterproductive. By incentivizing women to have children and not to marry in many cases, it's actually entrenched the very poverty that it was meant to fight. No less orthodox a liberal than New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof, after a recent visit to Appalachia, which is where I come from, as you kindly mentioned. Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, just in the past couple of months, wrote a column in which he said, "I hate as a liberal to admit this, but the great anti-poverty programs that we put in place in the 60s and that we so deeply believed in have very often turned out to harm the very poor people that they were meant to help." Well, he's right about that. I myself observed it growing up in West Virginia. I've now studied it, although not as intensely as some people who are professionals in sociology and political science. My own work is more philosophical. But I've looked at it closely enough to see that that is absolutely true. And part of the problem was we failed to attend to the fact that the best way to fight poverty is to build the marriage culture and to maintain the marriage culture. Marriage is the greatest anti-poverty mechanism or program that's ever been invented. If we want to keep people out of poverty, if we want to bring people up out of poverty, what we need to do is to make sure they finish school, they get a decent education, they avoid having children and avoid sexual promiscuity until they're married, avoid sexual promiscuity ever, of course, but avoid having children until they're married, and that they end up in a good and stable marriage. Your odds of being in poverty, if you finish school, if you stay married, if you're equipped to do a good day's work, are very, very low. You're very likely to be employed. You're very likely to do fine. It doesn't guarantee you're going to be a millionaire, but it will almost guarantee, I have to say almost because it's not 100%, but it will almost guarantee that you will not be in poverty.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to switch over and discuss the recent cases heard by the U.S. Supreme Court regarding marriage. Could you discuss that a little bit? What has transpired? I know there was a couple of cases. Maybe you could elucidate us on that.
Sure. There are two cases that have been argued and are currently pending before the Supreme Court of the United States. They've worked their way up through the legal system. One of those is a constitutional challenge to a California law that was put in place by a referendum, that is the people voting in a referendum, a ballot initiative, that restored to California the conjugal understanding of marriage as the union of husband and wife. Groups who wish to redefine marriage claim that under the federal Constitution's equal protection guarantee, which is part of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, having conjugal marriage, having the law embody the view that marriage is the union of a husband and wife, is unconstitutional. So that's one of the cases. The other case concerns not a state law, but rather a federal law. This is the Defense of Marriage Act that was enacted by Congress during the Clinton administration in the 1990s by large bipartisan majorities. And among other things, the Defense of Marriage Act defines marriage as the conjugal union of husband and wife, as a conjugal partnership, for purposes of federal law. So no matter what a state law says, the federal law doesn't interfere with a state law. It leaves the law of Massachusetts just the way it is. It doesn't purport to tell Massachusetts what its law of marriage is. But it establishes for purposes of federal law, whenever marriage is used in the federal code, that marriage will refer to the union of husband and wife. That, too, is being challenged. That provision is being challenged by the same people wishing to redefine marriage, but on two different grounds. One is, again, an equal protection challenge, saying that defining marriage as the union of husband and wife is a violation of the equal protection rights of people who want to enter into same-sex partnerships and have them recognized as marriages. And then secondly, on federalism grounds, that is, the claim here is that the federal government, the national government, is not entitled under the Constitution to have its own view or law of marriage. It has to simply accept for federal purposes whatever a state treats under its laws as marital. So we're waiting for decisions in both of those cases. I expect them by the end of June. There's been a lot of speculation, but no one is going to be able to predict, I think, how the court will rule. We've learned time and time again that it's a bad bet to claim you know how the Supreme Court's going to rule in a case. So we're just going to have to wait and see. And I hope they do the right thing and uphold both the conjugal conception of marriage as within the legitimate constitutional prerogatives of a state and the conjugal definition of marriage as legitimately within the authority of the federal government for purposes of federal law.
Well, now, in California, that Prop 8, I understand it went up through the California Supreme Court and was decided by a judge, one judge, to overturn about 8 million votes. And it turns out that that judge who decided was a homosexual, and then he quit after he made his decision, several months after he made his decision, he quit his position as a Supreme Court justice in California. Wouldn't that be part of the argument of traditional family marriage, that this person was biased and should have never taken the case in the first place?
Well, the procedural history is actually even more complicated than you've said there. I could spell the whole thing out, although it would take a few minutes. The judge you are talking about is Judge Von Walker, who was not a state judge or a state Supreme Court judge. Rather, he's a federal judge. He was the judge in the federal district court, the trial court, the lowest level federal court, that first ruled for purposes of the federal system on Proposition 8. And he indeed did rule that Proposition 8 was unconstitutional as a violation of the equal protection guarantee of the 14th Amendment. He does self-identify as homosexual. He self-identifies as gay. That's not a term that I favor using, but that's the term he uses for himself. His conduct of the case was dubious in a number of ways. And it's true that some people have complained that because he himself had an interest in the case, being a same-sex attracted person who is living with a partner or who has a partner, a same-sex partner, and he would therefore be ruling on something that he would be eligible to participate in if the ruling came out the way he in fact made it come out. Some have argued that it was inappropriate for him to rule on the case, and we'll see if any of the Supreme Court justices agree with that. This is not a criticism I myself have made. I think that people can be fair despite their self-interest in a range of different ways. I mean, you wouldn't want people with financial interests in a case or something like that. But imagine if the case were a challenge, which we had in the 1960s, for example, to laws forbidding interracial marriage in the South and elsewhere. And imagine that you had a black judge who was supposed to rule on the constitutionality of laws forbidding interracial marriage. I wouldn't want to say that the judge should not sit or should recuse himself because he can't be fair. I would assume that he could be fair on the issue, unless I had other reasons to think he couldn't be fair. I assume that he could be fair despite the racial aspect of the case. Now, on the other hand, the way Von Walker conducted himself, this judge conducted himself in the trial, seemed to show a tremendous amount of bias. But it's bias that, has no necessary connection to his own sexual proclivities or interests or self-identification. He just conducted the trial in a very unfair and biased way.
Mm-hmm. And did it go up to a panel of 3 judges in the federal, what they call the Ninth Circuit Court?
Yes, that's right. California, being a West Coast state, is in the Ninth Circuit. So the next stop on the way to the Supreme Court was the Ninth Circuit, and in the circuit courts, cases are heard usually by 3-judge panels, rather than the entire group of judges, which may be as many as 20 or 22, hearing the cases. So a 3-judge panel heard the case, and they upheld Von Walker's ruling, although not his reasoning in the case. They had different, more modest kind of reasoning in the case. But they did uphold his ruling that Prop 8 should be invalidated, but in a more limited way, and one that wouldn't have quite the national ramifications that Von Walker's ruling itself would have had it been upheld. So now we're going to have to see what the Supreme Court does with that Ninth Circuit ruling. The ruling was, the opinion for the 3-judge majority, the 3-judge panel, was written by a very, very liberal, an ultra-liberal judge who has been reversed countless times by the Supreme Court of the United States because of his ultra-liberal rulings, and that's Judge Stephen Reinhart. So if Judge Reinhart is reversed by the Supreme Court, that will not be surprising because he is very, very frequently reversed by the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. I see. It seems like there's so much tumult in our society these days. It takes my breath away sometimes. And on DOMA, here I've been seeing the media put forth people trying to soften the judges, like they did with nice articles for Judge Roberts about 4 or 5 weeks before the decision came down. They've had recently a basketball player say that he was outwardly gay, that even his twin brother didn't know about, and was treated with kid gloves. Do you think that these types of stories give a softening effect so that the judges can rule the way they want to rule?
Well, I mean, I think they're intended as part of a broader public relations campaign meant to influence the judges and influence legislators and influence the culture at large. I mean, that's the way the game is played. Folks on the left are very good at it. It helps, of course, to have such a lock on the elite institutions of the culture, on the media, the academic institutions, the professional associations, and so forth. We even now see it among business corporations and in sports. So yeah, I mean, it's what they're doing. It's the way the game is played. I'm quite confident that it won't influence most of the judges on the Supreme Court, and I just hope that it doesn't influence any, and that they will give us an honest ruling of what they believe the Constitution really does mean. And I think for most of them, if they do that, it will mean that conjugal marriage is upheld as perfectly constitutionally legitimate, and ditto for the Defense of Marriage Act.
I see. Well, Dr. George, our time has come to an end, unfortunately. There's much to discuss. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to be on our show today.
My pleasure, Brendan. Thank you.
You're most welcome. We hope you found today's show on the threats of traditional marriage and the denouement of our American society to be unique, informative, content-rich, truthful, and thought-provoking. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.